ability to have such insane blowout turns. And again, I think that same combination, Derek was talking about it in a different build of the deck, but then when you have Skull, you have the ability to just draw Lawkeeper Polk out at any turn and just say, that's my card draw set for the rest of the game now. Like, I just don't have to worry about it because I'll have infinite cards from this point by stacking the Skulls to the top. So definitely think Gia might be onto something when she calls this out to be the deck of the tournament. We did it, Raven. We're actually here.
Woo! Honestly, I'm pumped. We've got iG.Syf on the top playing the Demon Hunter, and we have Bankyugi on the bottom playing the Highlander Priest. Their first match in this World Championship. Everything on the line for these players. The winner will have such a great opening start to get into that top bracket. But let's get into it, Sottle. What do you make of these mulligans?
I mean, I would say if Syf has to wait 20 minutes to draw this hand every single time, I think he will take it. On the play, Battle Fiend, Beaming Sidekick, Wriggling Horror. Again, Bankyugi did mention that by playing Highlander Priest, he can afford to pack a few extra early removal cards in there. He is going to need them because this board state is going to snowball extremely rapidly. We do see that Breath of the Infinite combination in Bankyugi's opening hand, which he does choose to hold on to with the Dragon, but that's where the Beaming Sidekick can come into play now, Raven. And the extra 1-drop being picked up means that this curve is going to smooth out very, very nicely indeed.
And this is something I want to dive into straight away. Although, a lot of players may think, oh, aggro Demon Hunter, just play stuff, hit him in the face. These early turn decisions can have such an incredible impact on the outcome of the game. It is a lot more complicated than it seems to be. I think we roped so many times playing this deck in the first, like, turns 1 to 3. It's actually ridiculous. So keep a good eye on what iG.Syf is going to do here, because it is going to make or break this game, considering Bankyugi has a lot of that removal he talked about in his hand.
Wow, and that draw complicates things even further. He can now build so many levels of protection into this Battle Fiend if he wants to, but he has to offset with that with actually making it a threat, right? He actually needs to start getting those attacks going to start pushing damage through. So I do like this decision to just start trying to weave in an attack every turn. He can then potentially pair that with the Wriggling Horror on the next turn while weaving in the attack again. Then potentially give one of his threats Divine Shield while weaving in Hero Power again. Just trying to stick this Battle Fiend turn after turn after turn. But you might have heard me just exhale in reaction to Bankyugi's draw on the previous turn, because he is drawing the heat he needs right now. Double AoE with the Breath and the Holy Nova alongside Pyro Coin, and then he picked up Penance as well. Like, this is about as good an anti-aggro hand as Highlander Priest can really expect to see.
And I love this play from Bankyugi. This is what I was looking at. Penance now, even if, as we can see, there's some way to buff its health, say give it Divine Shield, well then it's Breath of the Infinite, then you Holy Nova, and then that should, in a lot of worlds, get him to at least a relatively safe point to be able to then go with that Cobalt Spellkin and then build out the rest of the turn potentially with Wild Pyro in the future. But this, like, Penance into back-to-back AoEs should be enough to at least stabilize him for now, which is all you really ask for against aggro Demon Hunter.
Yeah, absolutely love this. It checks so many boxes, right? It played around the Divine Shield naturally by putting it straight down to 1 health. It had beefed up the AoEs in his hand, as you were saying. I'll certainly confess that, you know, I do want to keep an eye on Bankyugi throughout this tournament, but first test so far, I'd say he's passed with flying colors. I don't think that was an obvious play to make, and he made it very quickly, and he's going to be rewarded for it here.
Now iG.Syf has some options. Again, one of the good things or benefits of running Skull in this deck is normally it's pretty easy to get it in one side of your hand for the outcast because all your cards are so playable, and we can see that now. The Stilt Stepper typically picking up another Stilt Stepper there, so not going to be playable for iG.Syf for that extra damage buff you get from Stilt Stepper, but still, he has put forward another scary board. But guess what, Sol? It ain't that scary if you're on Bankyugi's side of things.
It's not. I'm sure it'll just take a few seconds here to consider the possible tempo swing that comes from the Pyromancer, but since it would just end up getting cleared up by the hero power there anyway, seems quite straightforward just to end up going for the Holy Nova. And now Syf, really, this is just about clearing his hand for that Skull of Gul'dan. Wants to get that 1-drop played before his 6-mana turn coming up next. So just dropping it out on board for minimal value as a 2-1, pushing some damage.
Yeah, I'm very different in this deck. The Skull isn't a... It's never a gamble, it's never a bad play, but it's not, oh, I hope I get this, or I need to get this. A lot of the time in aggro, Demon Hunter you're going to be drawing zero-cost cards you want to flood on the board and kill your opponent with. So any kind of outcome is great. And was that the other skull? Okay. Well, there's the whole deck drawn, effectively.
Indeed. Play the one on the right, because the one on the left retains outcast position. And there's discounted Altruist now. Oh! You know your opponent is playing an Alucia deck, though. That's the scary part of just holding on to a bunch of Altruist juice.
If this was a ladder game, I would definitely hold everything, set second skull, and then just try and kill them with Altruist the turn after. But you are right, of course. Mindrender Alucia is a threat, and if Syf just hands over basically that hand, I don't really know how he claws back, because it's not as if Bankyugi's hand is that good to actually end games, right? This is all sustain on Bankyugi's side of things.
iG.Syf just loads up, presents the board again, but as we mentioned, Bankyugi absolutely nowhere short of answers for board states like this. Still has that Wild Pyromancer to rely on. The Cult Neophyte does have something to say about that, of course, but I do think primary concern here is the health total, more so over the board state, but Bankyugi has that side of things checked as well, with both Radiance and Renew in hand, which, you know, the more and more you talk through the turn, the more you realize how extremely clutch this Cult Neophyte was on this turn.
Yeah, even so, that Cult Neophyte has only really made the turn not as insane for Bankyugi, but he can just Pyro and then double heal, clear the board, keep his 3-5. It wouldn't be 3-5 at the time, of course, and be, what you'd argue, quite safe on health, right? After seeing 2 cards from the skull be played already.
Good chill. He's going to try and greed this out. Wants to hold on to this final board clear for some time, or it might end up being more threatening. It does, of course, give him that out of the Apotheosis draw as well, which would just be an absolute game ender at this point with the hand he has. And with only 2 damage on board, I think he'll be feeling relatively comfortable.
Yeah, I think for me, as long as he used a Radiance or Renew, he was going to be okay, right? As long as he healed himself to an extent if he wasn't going to clear the board. But there is another Cult Neophyte. And the Brawler and Still Stepper too.
Yep. Pushing all that extra damage now off the Stilt Stepper buff as well.
Board still very clearable here for Bankyugi, because he did hold on to that Pyro.
Yes.
And I can't imagine there's a world in which he aims the Renew at the Spellkin to keep it alive. I think every point of health needs to go to his own face for this one.
You would imagine so. I think a lot of it depends on whether he has a read on that skull, because if he thinks his opponent is running out of resources, he'll be 100% focused on healing, right? Because that's all that he really has to worry about at this point. But with the second skull in hand, Syf does have some opportunities just to win the board back on tempo, especially having seen now basically every AoE in the deck go down at this point, and with just, you know, Soul Mirror and Zephyrus being available. Although, I guess we are reaching the point of time where Plague of Death does become a factor as well.
There was a different option there as well, which was interesting. He could have picked Circle, right, and kept the Spellkin alive on higher health, but instead he chose to prioritize the Pyromancer with that Power Word Shield, just to say that, well, actually, most of the stuff you can still play as 1 to 2 health, really, so this Pyromancer, if it does get to live, guess what? I can probably clear the board again.
Right. This way he's making a 3-4 Pyro instead of leaving it as a 3-1 Pyro, so he's theoretically requiring cards to be thrown into it from Syf's perspective, and which makes it a much bigger threat to be dealt with. But that is absolutely not the case, because the world's nuttiest Altruist turn just completely makes a mess of that, and now with the skulls gone, that Voracious Reader refills the hand with a second Dreadlord's Bite alongside that Twin Slice. What did I say, Raven, about being able to just win again on board with so many of those early clears being removed? Remember, Bankyugi shouted this out. He said, "There's a reason why I like the Highlander Priest. There's so much more early clearing potential." Well, he's been proven right up until this point. He absolutely has found more early clearing potential with his Highlander version of the deck, but it's still not necessarily looking like enough right now.
Yeah, and honestly, the big problem for me is, are you realistically, in a deck like Priest, in general, Highlander or not, going to beat the basically skull into skull with this aggro deck? It seems so powerful. Syf is running a little bit low on cards, though, so he does need to end this relatively quickly, as he does have a ton of damage from the Twin Slice and the Dreadlord's Bite. I think he might just be seeing if he can get it done now.
Demons.
Let's see if it should add up. I think he's forced to trade the 4/5 in. Yeah, I think it's just not quite clean enough here. He has to put the 4/5 in just. He has to push, what, 8, 9 with the hero power.
Step up.
Well, he will forgo the hero power here, just go for the double 2-drop. Get that Voracious Reader to draw him an additional 3 cards, and it's getting very close. Where iSYF is actually just at the point where he's pretty confident in what he's going to draw, and must have a very clear game plan on how he's just going to end this game, and that Twin Slice was probably a part of it.
You don't pick the ones.
Yeah, Bankyugi looking like he's going to have to go fishing for some help here. Embalming Ritual is not the one, so he's going to resort to the palm reading now. Wave of Apathy still not good enough.
The problem is as well, even with Elucia, even like, I don't think there's an outcome he can dream of that actually helps him clear the board. So although he wouldn't give his opponent any aggressive tools, he just dies. So is he going to end on Elucia maybe?
I guess so.
He's going to try to anyway because of Thought Steal, right? He doesn't want to give him Thought Steal because then he could steal Demon Hunter cards.
Wriggling Horror allows him to push through, but still not good enough. But yeah, he dumped all the like damage dealing cards from his own hand, right? Like there was no point to give his opponent Inner Fire there when he was throwing out Wave of Apathy. So I think it was probably decent. The first step of the turn, I'm not 100% sure on whether it was better to look in the One Maker first or look at the palm reading first, to give yourself access to some more expensive spells off the palm reading, potentially to get yourself out of it. But I think he was in trouble there either way, and I think after all the work we did hyping up Aggro Demon Hunter, you couldn't get a better banner for the deck than that, because it had to solve every problem it possibly could have come up against in that matchup, and it did it with flying colors. You saw for such a ridiculously aggressive deck, I believe iSYF had, 4 cards left at the end of that game? 5 cards left at the end of that game?
Yeah, around that
just getting all the way through to the bottom of the deck. You know, he was in Polk out order and was drawing his 1-drops again that he'd already dumped a bunch of at the start of the game. So he was right down towards the bottom of the deck, and doesn't matter how much AoE you draw, you know, beating their top 25 with your top 10 is going to be very difficult for just about any deck to do.
Exactly, and honestly, excuse me, although Bankyugi had access to those AoEs, that Penance was clutch, or he would have just died sooner, I think. But really, for me, there was no Zephyrus drawn, which was a big deal, I think, for Bankyugi. But you wind back and say, well, actually, the no Apotheosis, which, wait, the other versions of Priest run 2 of those, and so on. You start to think, maybe the cards, say, with that Pyromancer and Apotheosis, would have been enough for him to actually just outlast the whole deck. But because of the benefits he's had from the Highlander Priest, there's of course those negatives as well. And I think we saw a mixture of both come into that game, but it does look like Bankyugi is going to be playing that Highlander Priest again. Yeah,
he clearly has a lot of faith in it. He's going to queue it up again. Again, I think a lot of the matchups will be very similar here. There is, of course, the Bomb Warrior left to deal with, which I think he will be fairly well equipped against, with, you know, Ooze, Sticky Finger, and Zephyrus being thrown in there. You know, Zephyrus can be a factor if it comes down on the first Wrench Caliber before the second bomb goes in. So it should have a decent matchup there. And again, with the other deck being Shaman, which relies just as heavily, if not more so, on a high-impact weapon. I think this is something that he definitely has had in mind with the build of the deck overall as well. So I think now just seeing those 2 matchups left over, it certainly makes sense for Bankyugi just to go back to the well with the Highlander Priest here.
Yeah, and here we go with the Evolved Shaman as well from iSYF, and this is where you might have to stop me, Sol, at some point throughout this cast, because I might slip into a Raven rant about Evolved Shaman, because it's a lot of the times, as I'm sure you're aware in our careers, you see, you just do this with this deck, and you just do this with this deck. And normally, we like to think we know what we're talking about. Well, actually, there's a lot of intricacies to how you play the game. There's a lot of things you can do outside. No. Evolve Shaman, you draw the Bog Spine Knuckles, or a way to draw them. You roll the dice on the Evolve, and then that's it. It's not necessarily true, Sol, but it's how I feel when I play the deck. So we'll see if Syf can maybe teach me a thing or two about this one.
Your feelings are important to me, Raven. I validate and support your feelings, but yeah, I think you are underselling the deck. Jambre, who is one of the biggest Shaman aficionados in the world, a person who's been playing this deck since it was terrible, and put out a guide recently that does go very, very in depth into a lot of the intricacies, because I think there's a lot of decks that have existed like this in the history of Hearthstone, where a player can pick this deck up and get perhaps a somewhat similar win rate to a top player, but the intricacies that lead to that top player finding that extra 2 to 5% win rate overall, those are the really hard things to find, and I think that is potentially where this deck shines.
Well, here we go. Let's get into it. Syf on the top on this Shaman. Bankyugi back to the Priest for game number 2. Tough one to mulligan for Bankyugi. What do you think he's actually looking for from his Highlander Priest deck to combat this? Do you think it's all weapon removal, or do you think going hard for weapon removal might be a little bit too slow, considering a lot of the time the first swing might be the one that gets you?
Yeah, that's the problem, right? If you can't really deal with the first board, we've seen a lot of situations where, the first Evolve board comes down and represents 15, 16 damage on board, meaning that you can't really just spend your entire turn playing Cobalt Sticky Finger in response to that, because you just take way too much damage on the backswing. So I think, first and foremost, a similar looking hand to what he had last game really would be ideal. Just, Penance the Cage Match Custodian, AoE the first board that comes down, so there's not just residual minions hanging around for that Bogspine Knuckles turn. And just try and keep the board as clear as possible, and then work from there with the weapon removal. So loosely, if you want a visual representation of sort of that perfect hand I was talking about, it's there. It's right there. It's at the bottom of your screen in Bankyugi's hand right now.
I go for the heal, not play the Zephyrus. I imagine that's going to be held for some kind of AoE to maybe negate a pre-setup weapon where you try and land hairs or something before then. But for me, this Nazmani is such a big deal. Like I mentioned, I've been playing some priests lately, and this just as a minion on curve that just has to be killed is such a problem for most opponents that even if they have the answer and trade into it, you still, as the priest, I feel like you're ahead of it.
Yeah. Didn't want to cut you off, Raven, but I was very interested as to whether Syf found the idea appealing of a 4/5 plus 4 damage every turn, because I think Bankyugi's hand and Bankyugi's deck contains answers to basically any threat he can present for the next few turns with the way this has panned out, except for this, right? Like, what is Bankyugi's response to this situation?
Right. And this is perfect, right? The Bloodweaver, without this play, looks almost immortal, but suddenly Inara, for the SYF managed to play last turn, well, the answer's just there and then some. Yes. Especially picking up this tour guide, not necessarily for this turn, but to again set up future turns. It's actually fantastic and paid off for SYF in spades.
Oh, the pauses here. Wow, okay. That is a little surprising to me, I will say. Does open up the minion to a couple of interactions. The healing totem does help, of course, because you can see right there, Penance was the big one, right, that you would be playing into without the totem by making the trade the way he did. But it does still present some options, as you can see right here, with the Pyromancer specifically, having that extra point of damage.
And I like this from Bankyugi a lot. Don't mess around. Don't try and be greedy. Get this off the board, because you'll die if you don't. And then there's still Holy Nova there. There's Plague of Death, which, yes, is much later down the line. But most importantly, he has Zephyrus as a backup. And if this Pyromancer isn't killed, he just has Apotheosis next turn.
It's very true. And speaking of if this Pyro isn't killed...
Never be afraid of your inner
Yep.
I think Instructor's the way to go. Is it worth a revolve? It's easy for us to say with we can see Apotheosis in hand, but Pyromancer's scary.
I like this, honestly. I was about to say, like, with the Bloom, that does increase your options. So Bloom Farsight is very reasonable here, because you then get the ability to potentially find another rebuy off the Fireheart as well. But this has worked out pretty nicely, honestly. Surf and Strike Portal for 0 to be able to deal with the Pyro. Very, very nice indeed. And SYF right back into his comfort zone. Stilt Stepper out onto the board again.
Yeah, and if you told me the alternative was this, then yes, I would have shut up instantly. The Bankyugi now has another awkward one here. I guess Holy Nova does do enough of a job.
Yep.
The Fireheart, not the end of the world, it's sticking around for a turn, so I think that's just a clean one. Pretty straightforward there from Bankyugi.
Yeah, agree. I think reflected in the lack of time that Bankyugi really took to consider it there as well. But it's starting to reach that point where it's a struggle to see how SYF is going to stick a board here against this massive removal that Bankyugi has in hand. He has a Zephyrus Clear available. He's starting to approach the point where Plague of Death can even start dealing with any like Colossus of the Moon or Scrapyard Colossus nonsense that can come into play as well. If the weapon comes down, there's the Ooze for it. I guess the kicker there is that there is the Horde Pillager to follow up if the weapon does get drawn and subsequently destroyed by the Acidic Swamp Ooze.
This is nice, though, from Yugi. The fact he's held onto this coin is a big deal as well, because it does activate that Plague that much sooner, which, again, can make the world of difference. SYF, I feel like we're going to say this a lot this weekend, Sol, but he's just not found the weapon yet. It's just a big deal. That's how the deck works, honestly.
Yeah, I'm getting the impression that might just be your drum to bang for the weekend, Draven.
At least I admitted it off the get-go.
It's true. You were very upfront about it.
Everset coming down now for SYF is a bit of a problem for Bankyugi to deal with at this moment in time, at least. Do you think he needs to, or should, follow this up with one of his minions? He has seen so much AoE. Ooh, it's a tough one, isn't it?
It is really hard, yeah. There's plus and minus. Obviously, like, playing Desert Hare or playing the Dread Corsair potentially adds the same amount of power to the board. They both add 3. But he doesn't get the ability to then Explosive Evolution on this turn. Both of those minions would go very nicely with the Explosive Evolution on the following turn, but holding on to those minions also plays really nicely with a Cage Match Custodian or Boxbind Knuckles draw. So there's various different branching paths there as to what the play ends up being. This is sort of what I was just approaching before I had to start, thinking things through out loud of like, well, maybe you actually play neither of them and you just totem up and turn it into a 4-drop instead. And I think, again, it's one of those things where if you'd have offered me this outcome, sure, I'll take it. But, you don't necessarily get a minion of the quality of Ascension Shieldmaster by making that play.
Whoa! SYF finally rewarded for patient play. And now he gets to use these minions however he sees fit. The Horde Pillager now just rockets in value, along with that Desert Hare in hand he has for next turn. But first, Bankyugi has to get over this hurdle that's on the board. Not the most threatening minions in the world there from the Evolve, but they're threatening enough. They have to be dealt with.
And this is the exact scenario I was talking about at the start of the game, where it's like, well, Bankyugi wants to use his Ooze. That's why it's in the deck for situations exactly like this. But if he does that, he doesn't have an AoE cheap enough to pair with it, so he's just tanking all the damage on the following turn. On the alternative, he goes the other way and just throws out the Plague of Death. SYF just has perfect refill with the hand that he has already, and the use is completely wasted.
I wonder if he could, Ooze Apotheosis. If you're expecting a second weapon and potentially second wave, then you have the Plague for that. I think that's the way I would look at going around there, because you'd imagine the Apotheosis Ooze is going to get traded into, which then makes your health pool a little bit better, which means you can soak that hit to then Plague afterwards.
Big outcomes, holds on to the Horde Pillager as well, which I love here. I was debating the idea of potentially just holding on to it because, again, it does mean this way he's going to at least get one opportunity to get that swing through if there is an Ooze or Sticky Finger on the other side. And that's because SYF understands the dynamic I was just talking about, right? he can't make the read that there's no weapon destruction because he understands the no-win situation that Bankyugi was in on the previous turn.
Dance, puppet, dance.
Ooh.
Okay.
You only got the 1/4, not the turtle.
Currently, SYF can deal with this board fairly nicely with the Horde Pillager and Stormstrike combination that he has available.
I'll just reroll the spell, which I do like, but I think an extra minion here. I think I'd like the One Maker to come down here for Bankyugi. I think just more stuff on board, because it's not really like you're expecting Shaman to actually kill you or want to kill all your minions, right?
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah, this is a big turn from SYF. Wow.
It is. So obviously he wants minimal melee damage to go into that Cabal Acolyte, try and reduce the amount of total healing that goes through, but he also wants to attack with as many minions as he can before the weapon, and those two things are kind of working directly against each other right now, so it's a pretty difficult turn to sequence optimally, I'd say.
It's a very interesting question as to whether, like, Stormstrike the 4/7 then going with the 4/3
right
would be good, right? Because then the 2/3 is actually a relatively high-costed minion.
Mm-hmm.
So that
then you get
attack,
to take
it can still
value trades with your other minions before you swing the weapon.
I like that. It does pain me when I have to swing without having the minions attack, but it looks like SYF changed his mind. He was considering it by looks things.
Okay,
well,
very, very
those
mediocre.
Are horrible.
Yep.
The taunt is actually pretty nice, though, just to protect those horrible 5-drops. Although, obviously, you would like good 5-drops, but at least they look relatively safe to be evolved again next turn. So there's a, you know me, Saul, I like to look for the silver lining sometimes.
Yes. And here's the thing, right? Here's, one of the big advantages of this deck is, like, okay, fine, they're not great. They don't have the best total stats you've ever seen. But they're there, they're alive, they're going to attack next turn, and then forget about them. They're going to be 6-drops next turn anyway, right? So, really, the amount of attack that he generated there would be the first thing he was concerned about, which, admittedly, he low-rolled on as well. But the fact that, he has a 2-health 5-drop and a 3-health 5-drop, not particularly relevant when Bankyugi doesn't really have any way to interact with it.
And he efficiently flew under the radar of the old Shadow Word Death as well, which you wouldn't normally expect with that kind of evolve.
Again,
what, 17?
This ooze?
Just straight up.
This ooze just still in hand. Wow, Evasive Worm is so clutch. Now, does SYF care about these minions, or does he just want to push damage?
I think I like the push in face plan, but I kind of always like that plan no matter the situation, so I'm not sure how much that's valid, but I just think these minions aren't significant considering how big his board's going to be. He's already seen the Plague used, so there's no, like, weird benefit of, well, if you trade, then you get more value from your minions, and then these minions can't attack you in the face, and so on. But I like this a lot. Just go full aggro now. Finish this game.
Gets the Reborn and Death Rattle, actually. That's a good chunk of protection against any AoE that would come down. But again, really, it's just an instant replay of the first game of the series, Raven. Like, Bankyugi had so many answers, but then his Highlander Priest, it just collapsed like a flan in a cupboard. Like, it just did nothing. It removed a bunch of boards, but then, where was the teeth? Where was the bite? Where was the swing turn? It's just, so far, these two games, Bankyugi scrapped and he stayed alive, but it really has felt like he's been waiting to die up until this point.
Well, it's the other half of this Highlander version, right? Is in the 2-of, you generate a ton of stuff always. Right, you're just always creating things, so your hand is always full, which negates the issue of priests not having card draw. that isn't the case with this list. So as you mentioned, you need a swing turn somewhere. And as we can see, that hasn't been the case. And that is partly down to the Highlander archetype.
Bankyugi did his level best. Like, in a vacuum, that was an insane Murazond, but just did not end up being enough to tear that board apart. And with the knowledge Bankyugi had that the extra weapon was in hand on top of just the lethal on-board damage, he knew he was a long way off from picking that apart, but not really much more I can add. It's just a very, very similar story to what we saw before. He had all the early answers, and he just did not find a way out of it after that point. And, you know, that wasn't even like the nut straw. From SYF, he used his bloom early, but it wasn't on weapon. It was on a threat that came down and was then dealt with that Pyro Penance combination. I would say if there was one spot where SYF perhaps had to get a little bit fortunate, it was on that Farsight turn, right? When he took the Farsight over the Revolve and then found the answer to the Pyromancer off it. That was a calculated risk. It was one I liked, and I said I was in favor of that play before the Serpent Shrine portal appeared, but after the fact, of course, the actual outcome was insane, because talking of swing turns, that was it. You know, Bankyugi had his swing turn with the Pyromancer, and it was looking for all intents and purposes like it was going to stick, but then SYF was just able to swing right back with that Farsight Serpent Shrine portal turn. So he is going to go up now 2-0 in the series, and one of those big weapon decks getting out of this series alive with a win over the Highlander Priest is a big dent to Bankyugi's overall chances, I would say.
And it looks like our next game, Sol. Bankyugi's taking some time off that Highlander Priest. We're going to get into a good old-fashioned, and I can literally say that honestly, Bomb Warrior Mirror. We've cast a few of these in our careers, but we are going to be diving into this one. And looking at it just on the surface, both deck lists do look very, very similar. I'm not sure if it's exact card for card. Bankyugi's running Acidic Swamp Ooze in his, whereas SYF is not, but they're both running the Owl in there as well. But really, just the core of it, pretty much the same on both sides here.
Yes, which means this is likely going to come down to just that push to assert dominance, right? Like, essentially, the player that earns the right to be aggressive by, you know, curving out better, fighting for board better, spending their mana more efficiently in the early turns, tends to be favored, because then they have the luxury to dictate the pace of the game. You do not want to be in the back foot on this matchup. You know, you don't want to be scrambling to remove minions every turn. You don't want to be defending yourself every turn. You want to just be spending your mana as efficiently as possible on drawing cards to the point where you just have a bunch of bombs going face to your opponent and shuffling bombs into their deck and slamming weapons into the face. But Blastmaster Boom timing, I do think, is a difficult one and something that needs to be looked out for, because the temptation can come when you do get a nice smooth curve into lots of bombs early to just like drop a Blastmaster Boom on curve, where I've seen that happen, where then the defensive player is able to recover and stabilize a little bit more, and the fact that they then have their Blastmaster Boom still available to them in the late game can be a sticking point. And so I do think things can go back and forwards a little bit, but first things first, get those Corsair caches, get those Wrench Calibers. Both players have that opportunity checked, and we are going to see a lot of damage being swung back and forth to the face pretty soon, I'm sure.
That's it, in very simple fashion. Goal number one, you want to just swing that weapon face every single turn of the game. That is the dream as the Bomb Warrior. We can see both players having access to a relatively high amount of charges of these weapons. Bankyugi not got hold of his Swamp Ooze tech that's in the deck, but I do agree on the Boom. I think we've seen Boom so much more powerful when it's more likely more than one bomb is going to go off for your opponent, right? Not just, you know, chipping away here and there. So we will see if that comes into it a little bit later on. But already both players keeping it, I'll say, fair. Both have had access to Wrench Caliber early on curve in the game.
Yeah, SYF does have the Corsair cache advantage, whereas Bankyugi has the I've already drawn double upgrade advantage. But yeah, this is this matchup in a nutshell. You want to get these big weapons going, and then basically every turn, well, did my opponent play a minion? Okay, I want to clear that with a card and not my weapon, and then swing my weapon at my opponent's face and just try and chew through all of that armor gain that they can generate and keep them under the threat of lethal as quickly as possible, because, again, the sooner you can put an extra factor into your opponent's decision-making, which is, oh, I might die. Like, if I play Cutting Class here, I might draw bombs and die. Like, as soon as that level of doubt goes into your opponent's play, you are massively advantaged in the matchup overall.
Yes, and I think when you were just breaking down then, can I tap face? Has my opponent played a minion? This new card that now both players have in their hand is huge in this matchup, as Minefield, pretty much for 2 mana, kills any singular minion your opponent's going to play, and your opponent generally will only play a singular minion on any given turn. So both players now having access to that Minefield means they can effectively have an additional swing of that Wrench Caliber to face, if they so choose.
Bankyugi just gonna giddy up. As Raven pointed out, SYF is not playing any Weapon Disruption in his version of the deck, so Bankyugi is free to just go all in on the first weapon that he gets here, as many swings through as possible. But SYF has a lethal-looking curve potentially on his side, with second weapon to follow this up, bunch of bombs going into the deck, 5 in total after both weapons are being exhausted, and then he does have the opportunity to go for that early tempo Blastmaster Boom to follow that up, if he chooses it to, which again, I want to reiterate, is not necessarily a given in the matchup.
And this is a very difficult decision here from SYF, because I think on the surface, swing, re-equip, pass looks good, because then his 6 mana can be used in a variety of ways next turn with double Quartermaster, shield block, to an extent Minefield. But if he swings and then passes, well, like we said, Bankyugi plays a Swamp Ooze, and although you can argue that it would have been played by now, I don't think you want to just... you wouldn't feel comfortable just playing it and then getting Ooze straight off the top. SYF is going to take that risk, which I do think is fair, because it makes his next turn potentially so much better.
Yes, and I do agree with the play, yeah. Again, I don't necessarily think SYF can make a hard read on no weapon in hand, because I think Bankyugi's mana would have been occupied on turn 4, for example. I think a lot of the time you'll play your own Wrench Caliber over destroying bears, because they could just respond with Horde Pillager in kind or whatever, and you've fallen significantly behind at that point. The turn 5 is a nebulous one, because it was just double upgrade and some floated mana. There's a good chance Ooze would have come down there if he had it, but definitely respect SYF's decision to just take the risk there, load up the Wrench Caliber, because as you said, it just makes this turn so much prettier, right? Like, if he went Evil Quartermaster Armor up on the previous turn, what was this turn then, right? Like, it just didn't make any sense at that point.
And this is so much better because there were different options as well. He still has the Minefield to weave in with one of these minions. He could have shield blocked if he drew a shield slam if there was an answer. There's just so many better options here. And we see now, probably for the first time in the game, SYF is looking a little bit more aggressive purely because he has minions. So Bankyugi will, if he needs to, of course, spend mana on dealing with these minions or just take an extra 4 next turn. But Sword and Board and Minefield do get the job done.
Yeah, I can choose to do it with the Kobold Lackey as well if he would like to. Might have some value later on. Yep, I agree. It has value in just sending damage to face. It also has value in just being a minion if you need to win like a Desperation Brawl at some point later on. Something that can just soak boom bots, for example, if you just need to get it into play when you're dealing with boom bots to prevent damage. And so I do like using the Sword and Board there, all things considered.
And this is the tricky moment here for both players, honestly. This looks incredibly powerful for SYF, and especially with that upgrade and Galakron in his hand. He is, I would say, just based on his hand and position, the aggressor here. But Bankyugi does have Brawl and does have Blade Storm for a worst-case scenario outcome, but he will take so much damage, and if he Brawls and Blade Storms, that's his whole turn. And then he has to just deal with whatever SYF does next. So this is when games can slip.
Brutal. Going for the Ironbeak Owl line here.
Ironbeak wins this every time.
Worst case! Raven!
This was the risk he took. It's slightly less damage from the bomb, but this was a element of risk. He could have guaranteed this not be as much of a problem with the Blade Storm, but this now is a huge, huge problem for Bankyugi.
7 extra damage. The other upgrade gets drawn as well to push even more. Oh, this is getting so painful if you're a Bankyugi fan.
Yeah, SYF has a Kobold Lackey of his own. Then there's I'm calling it Dread Corsair now. It's just wrong. That's too much shame getting in my head. The Horde Pillager, drawn from the Galakron. There's just infinite amount of damage now for SYF, and Bankyugi is just behind. and probably too far behind at this point. The Galacon hero power just does too much on top of all of this.
He's just one man off the desperation play he'd love to make here as well. Try and get some kind of tempo swing going with the Blastmaster Boom Bladestorm and get some pressure going back on himself. Deal a bunch of damage, clear the board, deal some damage to face, push more, draw some bombs. Maybe you could see a window then, but without that combination being available, he's in trouble.
And this is the issue now of where the deck can get a bit tricky is in the late game with some of these higher costed cards. Nothing really slots together that well, does it? As you mentioned, can't quite Blastmaster Boom Bladestorm. Deathwing just doesn't really cut it because it just dies or gets ignored anyway. There's just nothing that really fits so well there, whereas SYF has all of the options in the world.
Yeah, the armor up, keeping Bankyugi just out of range of the lethal outs on that turn, but there are now, I believe, 4 total bombs left remaining in this deck, which could be lethal, and let's not even start thinking about next turn yet. Is he going to survive this turn? No, he is not! That is a 3-0 sweep. China is on the path, potentially, to the World Championship. SYF joins his friend Zhao T in progressing through the winner's side of their groups, and that was one of the most brutally one-sided performances we have seen so far. It's a second 3-0, but if anything, that looked even more comfortable than what we saw from Yala in the opening game of our World Championships.
Yeah, it did look very one-sided, and I think, you know, a lot of viewers are going to think, oh, well, Highlander Priest, it sucked. It looked like it could get there, right? But there was just no way for him to end out those games. The Highlander Priest did look like it did what Bankyugi said it would do. The extra early removal tools helped keep him alive. It's just the end plan didn't pay off. And when you lose 2 games with that deck, it is going to be very hard, no matter what happens, to claw back a victory when you're 0-2 down. And it just didn't happen in that Warrior Mirror. So unfortunately for Bankyugi, he does lose. He's not out of the tournament yet. We are playing double elimination here, so he is not gone yet. But honestly, for the Asia Pacific representatives, it has not